Comic.
Comic. Boneless Comic. Podcast. Comic.
Comic.
Because they have no home.
Dun, 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 dun. You know the guy in the space ghost suit that's like dancing?
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast with the mouth, where you can try to kill us, but we'll just revive. This is We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. That's right. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White. And this is a clean comic book podcast, except for the promo art that I did for this episode, which is a little bit more violent than our normal fare, where we discuss and review comics by DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1, on Twitter at Boneless Comics Podcast, pretty much everywhere else.
That's right. This is a clean comic book podcast, even if sometimes the subject material is not, but Mike and I will be keeping it clean on the show, so no
That's
worries
right.
there.
Yeah.
And also make sure that you go out on the World Wide Web and check us out at bonelesscomicspodcast.com, where you can get more information about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, and a link to our YouTube channel where you can watch video episodes and find additional bonus content and see me dressed as Deadpool.
That's right.
Who doesn't want that?
Yeah, if you don't check out the YouTube channel, it's really fast becoming the ideal way to experience this because of all of Joe's crazy costumes and backgrounds and stuff. So that's what you're missing out on. Just that little bit of extra bonus content, and the also, I'm not sure what he's doing, kind of a spirit fingers thing right now too. You'd be missing out on that as well. So definitely check out the YouTube channel. A lot of cool stuff there. I have actually started doing, I've done just a couple YouTube shorts. So I sort of a meme-ish one that I did for May the 4th. So, but I did get to show off some of my Star Trek comics, so that was a good thing. But
All right. Good time.
today we're going to be talking about Deadpool Secret Invasion, which collects Deadpool issues number 1 through 3, published in 2008 by Marvel Comics, written by Daniel Way and penciled by Paco Medina.
Yeah, so we're going to have a conversation about Daniel Way here, and that is of significance, and I'll tell you why in just a little bit. Just a little bit of background on him. He's an American comic book writer who wasn't a big comic book reader when he was younger. He was only able to read stuff they had like at the barbershop, the Donald Duck comics and stuff like that. He eventually made friends with a comic book store owner who was starting to push comics on him because, you know, he owned a whole lot of them and was trying to sell them. And he pushed one on Daniel Way called Hellblazer and told him to give it a try. And he really liked it. He really liked it and realized that comics were more of like a medium and not a genre. So you could really just tell any kind of story you want through comics. I mean, it seems like, you know, nowadays we know that, but, you know, back then was not as much common knowledge, or there was some more stigma around it. So, but eventually that got him into writing. He started telling his own stories, and he wrote his first comic book, which was self-published, called Violent Lifestyles, which ended up in the hands of Axel Alonso, who had just come over from Marvel, from DC and Vertigo, and offered him a job. So self-published his own comic, landed it big right from the beginning, and, you know, the rest is history.
That sounds like Rob Liefeld.
Yeah. His credits include, well, and that's a good conversation for, you know, talking about Deadpool, too, to bring up Liefeld.
Right, I know.
But more on that later as well. But Daniel Way's credits at Marvel include Wolverine, Agent X, Venom, Sabretooth, Open Season, Bullseye's Greatest Hits, Ghost Rider, The Incredible Hulk, Supreme Power, Nighthawk, and Wolverine Origins, where there was a surprise cameo from Deadpool in the comic, which was sort of him like testing the waters before actually taking on his solo book, which that, you know, happens quite a bit. But the controversy that I mentioned is specifically on his take on Deadpool, and we can get into this, you know, specifically later. But basically, people seem to either love it or say that he ruined the character.
Wow.
The biggest thing is giving him voices inside of his head, which kind of put him in the realm of like a Moon Knight character instead of just being like a crazy sociopath. And he's more kind of the like OMG, random crazy LOL side of things than he was previously. So he's very like nutty and squirrel and, you know, distracted by something kooky and not altogether spooky. That's a different episode, but there's a lot of people one way or the other on that. So make sure you tell us on Twitter what you think at Boneless Comics 1.
That's really fascinating because that take on the character is the closest to what I know of him.
Mm-hmm.
So I am aware that there was a time when Liefeld and I think it's Nicieza were
Yeah.
writing the character that he was played a little bit more seriously,
Yep.
but
And
I don't
that's
I don't think I knew that this was like such a hard cut into comedic territory.
And that's the problem that diehard fans have, is that a lot of people, especially in 2008, where we have like the Iron Man movie and the MCU starting to pick
Mhm.
up, people are getting into comics more because they're seeing them on the big screen and thinking they're cool. They jump in, they read Daniel Way, they're like, oh, this is Deadpool. He's a cool guy. He has voices in his head and he's really crazy. And the diehard fans are like, no, this is not Deadpool. This is a variation that this guy did and it's completely different. And no, no. So, how fans can get when they're super, stoked about their version of the character. But Deadpool, I think, is one that can be, anybody's version of anything. He can
Mhm.
really fulfill a lot of niches here in the comic book world. But
Yeah, well, this run that we're covering today is definitely more comedic, and
oh yeah,
I think, and something we can talk about during our story discussion is how the art kind of plays into that a little bit because I do think that it has a big impact on the humor. But
hmm
our penciler today is the Mexican artist Paco Medina, who was born in 1983, so just a year after the two of us. Grew up loving reruns of the old Marvel superheroes 1960s cartoon, which he was watching with his brother. His father would occasionally bring them home newspaper strips or comic magazines, which Medina devoured as a child, which kind of cultivated his love of Marvel and specifically the characters created by Jack Kirby. His favorite action figure as a child was Iron Man, though he later branched out into starting a significant X-Men and Spider-Man collection. So he did begin his professional career at DC, but his true love are the Marvel characters. So this is somebody that really is more Marvel centric at heart. And he spent nearly 2 decades working on nearly every title they published, beginning with an early stint on Fantastic Four, which is why I had heard this name before. So there is a small arc that he penciled about the Frightful Four, and every time they come back, it's a little bit different team roster and everything. But I remember the art fondly because I wasn't a big fan of the artist right before him. So I remember seeing Medina's work and going like, oh, okay, like the book is going to be okay now. So spoilers for later, but I actually do enjoy his art quite a bit. But basically, he wasn't happy with his personal or his professional life in the early 2000s. And so when he was working at DC, he wrote Joe Quesada at Marvel a personal letter. And after looking at his work, Quesada asked him to join Marvel Comics. So he just mailed him a letter and
wow.
was like, hey, I want to work there. I'm not happy where I'm at. Showed him some samples and he's like, yeah, okay, come on, work at Marvel. Like it was that easy. So not, I would wager how most people get into the industry, but yeah, it worked out for him. So anyway, on Deadpool specifically, he said that he considers Deadpool his crazy partner, as he describes himself as a crazy man with a lonely life. So that's an interesting take
Hmm.
on the Deadpool character. He's also strongly associated with the Sam Alexander iteration of Nova, a book that is very personal to Medina, as he worked on it during a time when his mother got sick and passed away.
Hmm.
And Sam Alexander is kind of like looking for his lost father, and that's like out in space, and that's kind of part of his storyline. So I can see how that would kind of resonate with him a little bit. Alexander is also one of the more prominent Hispanic characters in Marvel Comics, perhaps owing some of his appeal to Paco Medina's own cultural understanding and background. So this next portion are my observations, not stuff that I picked up, but I just looking at his art style, what I would say is that he's really influenced by some of his precursors in the early 90s, like Jim Lee and especially Joe Madureira, because Joe Mad is the guy that was really influential in bringing a lot of anime style expressiveness and hair and even like detailed action set pieces into American comics. So this feels very of that period and very
Hmm.
influenced by that. It doesn't look like a Marvel house style where it's kind of like stock heroic stuff. It really does feel like it's got, it's a little bit cartoony. Some of the characters have spiky hair. Their eyes are a little bit exaggerated, although not to the extent that anime would be. And the proportions just barely push the envelope away from realism to show kind of like bigger expression in, like if Deadpool's posing, it's going to be really dramatic. It's not going to be just like kind of a halfway thing. So
Yeah.
and he also currently does all of his own inking, though he didn't at the time this story was published. So
another interesting observation I think about this, just these 3 issues that we're reviewing, is that there really aren't a lot of humans to draw because Deadpool wears a mask, so there's not really any facial features there. The Skrulls don't really have hair, and they're very green. So this was kind of an atypical thing, I think, to draw, where there's like not really any people except for like Nick Fury.
Yeah, Nick Fury is about the only human character, and a bunch of dude bros at an Atlanta Braves baseball game at the beginning that have Braves painted on their chests. I think those might be the only humans we see for the whole story. So
Well, as you alluded to before, Deadpool was actually created by Fabian Nicieza and Rob Liefeld, and first appeared in New Mutants number 98 in December of 1990. Liefeld was responsible for Deadpool's visual style and name, and he was also a fan of the Teen Titans comic, and he showed his character to Nicieza, who said, "This is Deathstroke from Teen Titans." So they gave him the name of Wade Wilson as an inside joke to being related to Slade Wilson, Deathstroke from DC. Then, similar to Deathstroke, Deadpool is a highly trained assassin and mercenary, athlete, and an expert swordsman and marksman. But unlike Deathstroke, however, Deadpool's primary power is an accelerated healing factor, which has been depicted by various writers at differing levels of efficiency. They've made it like really super aggressive. They've made it to where they actually took it away at one point. So there's a lot of variation there. His brain cells are similarly affected, with dying neurons being rejuvenated at a super accelerated rate, which allows him to recover from any head wounds. So he can literally, have a hole in his head, which he does in this story. You can actually see his brain tissue through his skull because his skull is missing. But he recovers from that and is able to actually function, while that is going on too. It also renders him nearly invulnerable to psychic and telepathic powers, although there are some inconsistencies with this depending on the writer, but largely that's something that he kind of doesn't have an issue with. But before he gained this power, he suffered from some form of cancer, and then after the healing factor was given to him, it made his normal cells as well as his cancerous cells unable to die, giving him a heavily scarred appearance beneath his suit. And so basically the saying goes that he has one foot in the grave and the other one is in like La La Land, or something like he's half alive and half dead. He's kind of like the Pavlov's anti-hero, I guess, of the comic world.
Pavlov's anti-hero.
Another trait of Deadpool is that he's aware that he is a fictional comic book character, and he commonly breaks the fourth wall where he speaks to the reader directly, or he calls out real life things in the comic world, and people look at him like, who is this that you're, what's Liefeld? Why did you say that? Why did you say that name? But, why, what does that have to do with anything? I think he makes a reference to, you can never have enough you can never have enough pouches. And he's like, thanks, Rob, or something. And they're like, who's Rob? The Skrulls are confused. Another trait too, and one of my favorites, is that he's very unpredictable, and similar to Spider-Man, he'll banter with his opponents to throw them off guard. And even Taskmaster, who has a photoreflexive memory, which allows him to copy anyone's fighting skills by observation, was unable to defeat Deadpool due to his chaotic and improvised fighting style.
I think it helps that Deadpool doesn't know what he's going to do from one moment to the next either.
He makes it up as he goes. So there's nothing to predict because he doesn't even know.
Right.
So we talked a little bit about Daniel Way's version of Deadpool, or Waypool, as some people call him, who's a bit different from the typical Deadpool that some fans may know, or like longer term comic book fans. So there's actually an interview with Daniel Way where he explained that the white first-person narrative caption box is kind of what he's really thinking. Then there's the yellow box, which is his diary, and that's kind of what he wants you to think he's thinking. But there are times when that completely flip-flops. It's like he can't keep things straight. Deadpool very much lives in a world of his own construction, so he's not very big on rules and order. Everybody has those warring impulses, the angel and the devil on your shoulders kind of thing. But it's just that in Deadpool's case, they're both devils. Like, neither one of them is really looking out for anybody's best interest.
No.
So, because I don't know if it's because fans complained or because we just have a different writer, later they decided to retcon this extra voice to actually say in Deadpool Volume 3, Annual Number 1, 2014, it belonged to a psychotic Captain America villain named Madcap who had become molecularly entangled with Deadpool. And that's why he had an extra voice in his head, was because he was stuck with Madcap in his head. So
how does one become molecularly entangled with another being?
that is probably a topic for another podcast episode. But in this story, we have the Skrulls and the Super Skrulls that play a major role in here. So if you've seen the Captain Marvel movie in the MCU, you already know a lot about the Skrulls, except that they're actually the bad guys. They are extraterrestrial shapeshifters, and they first appeared in Fantastic Four #2 in 1962 and were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
What do you know?
Yeah, right. We also have the Super Skrull, which MCU fans are probably not familiar with, although we have seen a version of it before. Basically, it's a superior version that possesses the abilities of several different heroes. In this case, in this story, it's fire and ice, which there's a whole bunch of wisecracks about that we'll get into. But if you remember the Fantastic Four movie all the way back in 2007, Johnny Storm and Ben Grimm, aka Human Torch and the Thing, have this accident where they keep swapping their powers. And at the end of the movie, Johnny absorbs all their powers to battle Dr. Doom. Well, this was actually an idea that was taken inspiration from the Super Skrull that appeared in the comics back in the 60s. So we have kind of seen it on screen, but it was more just, Johnny doing crazy things in a movie that a lot of people have disowned who love.
Yeah, it wasn't the best Fantastic Four movie for sure.
Yeah, well, that's it for our character rundown and writer and artist. So take a look at this quick clip and we will be right back.
Deadpool, branded as both hero and villain. Deadpool was once a mercenary named Wade Wilson. After being recruited into the Weapon X program, Wade was subjected to experiments that gave him awesome regenerative powers and drove him crazy. Today, the Merc with a mouth travels the globe in search of fortune and chimichangas.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to jump right into the story. So a little bit of background before we get into the 3 issues that we're covering is that just like the Miss Marvel story that we did last year, this is an event tie-in to an event book. So the event is Secret Invasion, which is a story that I think came out in 2007, 2008, somewhere around there. And this was an event that had been building really out of the pages of New Avengers for a while, where they discovered that Elektra was a Skrull. And they were like dissecting her on a table, and that was how they sort of discovered, like Luke Cage and the other New Avengers, that the Skrulls were invading the planet. But they were doing it by shapeshifting and assuming the identities of other superheroes. So that's sort of a change in their strategy, because they had always attacked more directly before. So the secret in the Secret Invasion is that, like, it's kind of invasion of the body snatchers. Like, there's aliens among us everywhere. But the reason for this mainly is that in the pages of Fantastic Four, Galactus had actually eaten the Skrull homeworld and destroyed it. So they have no homeworld. So they're looking to colonize somewhere. And they were sort of mobilized behind their religious leader, the Queen of the Skrulls. And so she basically moves everybody into this kind of like religious fervor, and they decide that, like, it's their right to own Earth, and that's like their destiny. And so they come to Earth with that agenda. This also was specifically in retaliation to something that was done in a very early issue of Fantastic Four, where Reed Richards actually hypnotized 4 Skrulls into believing they were cows. And these Skrulls have been living on Earth. And that story actually was picked up later by John Byrne, where there's a whole town that's been like drinking the milk of these cows, and they're all acting weird. And then you find out later, like, oh, it's the Skrulls that Reed hypnotized. so in the Secret Invasion book, the Queen actually makes a mention of, like, this is for, what they did to us all those years ago, like humiliating us and making us assume the forms of these lower life forms. So that's a little bit of backstory on why Secret Invasion is happening. But For the purposes of this story, Earth has been under siege by the forces of the Skrulls for a little while now. Heroes like the Avengers, Nick Fury's Secret Warriors, and the X-Men have stepped forward to defend their home planet from the secret invasion. The reason the Fantastic Four are not there is because within the event title, they were taken off the board in like the first issue. So uh, they're not really, they went right for Reed first because he was the one that they had the biggest beef with. So he was taken out like almost immediately. There is one hero that has gone on the offensive all by himself, though, and his actions might just have saved the world. And his name is Deadpool. Actually, his name is Wade
Deadpool.
Wilson.
Oh yeah, it is.
Hero name or anti-hero name is Deadpool.
Yeah.
So that which brings us to our issues. So again, while the other heroes are engaged in a battle royale with the Skrulls, a lone ship lands inside a baseball stadium defended by one man, Wade Wilson, dressed in a sports mascot outfit. And I looked this up. The sports mascot is actually the accurate mascot of the Atlanta Braves, except that they changed the color of it. Like they made him green, he's brown. But he's a mascot called the Blooper. The Braves have the Atlanta Braves Blooper, and he looks almost exactly like the mascot that they do in this comic book. So that is accurate to the real world. So anyway, dressed in a sports mascot outfit, Deadpool single-handedly defeats the entire Skrull vessel before switching sides to join them. While it's unclear if this was planned or just a series of fortunate events, Deadpool is eventually captured, cloned, and put in charge of his own corps of Skrull clones for the Empire. But even though his clones are insanely powerful, both Wade and his clones prove to be too mentally and physically unstable to be controlled, causing a bloody mess that the Skrull Empire will take a long time to recover from. And that's pretty much what happens in these 3 issues. So
that's it. Yeah.
There's cloning, there's a baseball stadium, there's switching allegiances. It's got everything you could want in a superhero story. So
yep, and a lot of Deadpool off the cuff, just doing things. And like you said, it's like, was this planned to any sort of degree, or was it just like, well, I'll show up and see what happens, and oh, they're dissecting me, oh, they're cloning me, okay, this can work.
It really doesn't seem like there's any way he could have known or planned for the events in this story, but the way things play out, it feels like he did, and that's really weird.
Yeah, well,
because
I mean,
how
maybe
could he know they were going to clone him?
Yeah, true. Well, maybe they were, hoping that they would use his DNA to some degree, and maybe it just worked out a lot better than he thought with the group of clones. Maybe he was just kind of hoping that like his genes would like infect whatever it was that they were experimenting with. So maybe it was one of those, like, he was hoping that they would, take his genetic material, which would cause an issue, but then it ended up being a lot more comical than maybe what he planned.
Right.
Who knows? Not even he knows. So don't even ask.
I don't think he does. So I guess a good place to start with the actual story discussion is, have you read the Secret Invasion standalone title, or were you familiar with it prior to this? I know that we'd both been reading New Avengers around this time, but I don't know if you've read the event book proper.
So I'm going to be completely honest. I have not read this event book.
Okay.
But it's one of those that, like, the whole premise and everything, like you explained, is pretty self-explanatory, like with the Skrulls and impersonations and body snatchers and that sort of thing. And then after kind of reading this like Deadpool mini arc of Secret Invasion, I don't know, it just never was something that I felt like I really needed to go and read, that I was like super excited about. And maybe it was because I wasn't really reading Fantastic Four, so the Skrulls weren't like, oh cool, what are they doing next? It's just like, oh, these green guys are weird, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, I have read it, and what I can say about it is I think the event fails on several levels.
Oh.
And number one is the ad campaign for it was phenomenal. They have like real stock photos that they pulled from Shutterstock of like people doing regular everyday things, like eating ice cream in the park or going to a baseball game. But then they've like photoshopped one of the kids to have a Skrull face. And they're like, we're here among you and we're not here to harm you and all this stuff. And like the ad campaign was just great. It was so entertaining.
I remember seeing some of those. That's right.
Yeah. So you get to the event book itself and they play it very seriously. And I think my biggest problem with it is that at no point do you see them infiltrating any level of society beyond the superheroes. So
Hmm.
they say that they're everywhere, but they're really just going after the heroes. And it doesn't feel like the general population, like you don't have like a Skrull in the White House. You don't have like
Yeah.
Skrulls reporting for the media or anything like that. It's more
Huh.
just like they're going after the superheroes and supervillains, and it seems like we kind of forget that the rest of Earth exists. So
Hmm.
they have a lot of battle out in the Savage Land with like Kazar, and they think Tony Stark might be a Skrull for a while. And there was speculation actually that they were going to maybe blame Civil War on, oh, maybe Tony was a Skrull, and that's
Ah.
why Civil War was so bad. But it was actually used to further like send Tony to the bottom of the barrel at this point in the comics, but he
Hmm.
was really like spiraling bad, and this did not make it better because he didn't think he could trust anybody. Nobody trusted him. And so for the Iron Man character, it was, I guess, kind of like a good story moment as far as like moving his narrative along. But for the overall universe, like I never really felt like they were that threatened by them. As
Hmm.
soon as the secret invasion starts, it becomes public and it's not a secret anymore. And then we have like, I kid you not, like 10 double page splashes in a row of all the heroes fighting the Skrulls
Wow.
towards the end of the book. And while that's really cool because the penciler was good, it takes you like 2 seconds to read. And so it's just kind of like you can only do so many big set pieces in a row with no dialogue
Yeah.
before you're like, okay, it's another panel of seeing all the heroes attack bad guys. Like,
You're
all
just kind
right.
of overwhelmed, like, okay, this is a great art book, but let's get back to
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah. So
Well, and
it kind of, yeah.
maybe that's something that the Secret Invasion series on Disney Plus that comes out soon is going to make up for, because it
Hmm.
really looks like it's more of what you're saying the original story was not, where, we have Nick Fury and it looks like he's chasing after people who are either in the government or they're CIA or, various levels of
Right.
the organization. And it didn't seem like they were going to have any actual superheroes in it, although, with the rumors and everything, there's all kinds
Sure.
of stuff here and there. But that one seems like it's going to be more of like maybe more of a spy show kind of thing, which I think
Yeah.
would be way more interesting than just watching heroes, fight all kinds of shapeshifters.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. The big thing that came out of this story was that Reed and Tony and Hank Pym all agreed that they were doing something different where they can't detect them genetically. Like they're actually genetically becoming the thing that they're shapeshifting
Mm.
into. So they didn't have a way to scan for them where they could tell what was going on. So they did replace Abigail Brand, I think, as the head of Sword. And she's the one that like fends off extraterrestrial threats from Earth. So that felt like a big deal, but they
Hmm.
do kind of just brush it aside to do all the big action stuff, and then
Yeah.
it's kind of over. Um, this is set up for the next sort of era of Marvel, but that also has to do with the conclusion of this story. So we can get there when we, get to the
Yep.
end. But uh so I guess we've talked more broadly about the event, but as far as this story, um I have not read any Deadpool solo comics before. I've read Deadpool with Cable, Deadpool with the X Force, but never like by himself. I've never read
Hmm.
that. So I felt like this actually was a pretty decent introduction, which surprised me because event titles are not normally where I would go for that. But I don't know what you felt about that.
Yeah. So another characteristic of Daniel Way's writing is that I think he even said in an interview, he didn't want this to be Deadpool and Friends. And there's like
mm,
various titles out there where it really is kind of that. It's like Deadpool and his compatriots, and you have like Blind
sure.
Owl, and you have Bob from Hydra, and you have all these guys that
Hmm.
start to, you have Weasel, and they start to show up more regularly. But
Sure.
in Daniel Way, he's like, I want to have cameos and have people, kind of come and go, but no like
Hmm.
recurring characters. So I think that really, fits into like this story
Okay.
being, him just completely totally on his own. And maybe, that was the writer's choice, and he actually, got his way to have an event tie-in, which really,
Right.
I mean, it's like it's big, but it's not big. It's just like a small
Sure.
corner of what's going on in the entire the entire universe here at this point, but at the same time, the ending sort of alludes to, threads that can be pulled on later. So
yeah. And the ending to this does directly tie into, it's the biggest part of this story that is like actually strongly linked narratively to the Secret Invasion story, because it ends up with Norman Osborn, and that's something that happens at the end of the event title as well, as Norman Osborn saves everybody, and he becomes sort of like everybody's favorite boy all of a sudden. So that's definitely something that they go after with this story. So it was interesting to me. I think I have a predisposition to not want to read something just because it's an event tie-in a lot of times, because I'm often irritated with the way events will take over an existing title whenever I'm reading it. And like you've talked about on The Flash or Supergirl or whatever the show is, where they'll be doing their narrative for the season, and then it's like, oh, well, it's time for, May sweeps week. So we got to do our crossover between all the shows so that they all get higher ratings. And it kind of feels that way in comics too, where it's like, all right, I guess I have to read this to know what's going on, but I hate feeling like I'm being forced to buy something when I just wanted to read about Deadpool, or I just wanted to read about Fantastic Four. So this, going into it, I had like a negative sort of perception of it, just knowing it was an event tie-in. So it was very surprising to me that we actually show his origin in the second issue. He actually explains like pretty much what happened to him, that he had cancer. He went through the Weapon X program just like Wolverine did, and he was actually given the healing factor there, which, like I mentioned earlier, was not something that I knew. I thought that he was just born with it. So I actually appreciated that Way sort of like brought us back to that moment, even though it was in the second issue. He kind of like, I don't know, it's almost structured like a James Bond movie, right? Where like you have to have the big chase sequence first. So you have the big action set piece, and then you get into the story, like after the credits, basically. So that's kind of what the first issue was, where it was just like, he's just blowing away a bunch of scrolls and stuff. And then once we actually get inside the ship, we get into the story in issue 2, where he's like telling his past, and you kind of understand a little bit more about where Wade is coming from. So I don't know. I thought that really helped to ground it for me. So.
But it had the advantage of, these were the first 3 issues of a run. So it's not like, because I think the book was on hiatus for a while and then came back with Daniel Way. So there wasn't anything that he was doing that would have been, changed to, have Secret Invasion take over his storyline. So we didn't have to, worry about his storyline being taken over. But at the same time, Deadpool is so crazy and versatile that, I mean, he has so many titles where he's doing something that's his own version of either an event, or just like he kills the entire Marvel universe,
right,
or he's fights a bunch of zombies, and it's almost like he's the wild character that you can take any story and you can just throw him into it, and he'll be himself. He'll do his thing and be the same no matter what, going through that story. And a lot of writers, I think, have done that, where it's like, let's put Deadpool in this situation and see how it plays out differently, than like the Avengers or one of the other main groups. But to your point, like, since this was, the first couple issues of a run, we also had to give you a little bit of, okay, if you're not familiar with Deadpool, here's a little bit of, recap. And like, it's funny because they show him like literally being flushed down the drain, like he was a rejected experiment, which was really funny. And they kind of give you a little bit of hype at the end of the first issue too, because they're like, Deadpool's fighting the Skrulls, and at the end he's sort of like, okay, am I captured? Whatever.
Yeah.
He surrenders, but then he's like, I want to sign up and join the Skrull Empire. Did you actually think that he was like crazy and he just wanted to join them and see what it was like and it was going to be fun, or did you think he had like another angle he was playing?
So, knowing what I know about the character, what I felt was that he just thought that would be funny in the moment, and then was like, I'm going to ride this out and see where it goes. So that feels very like in line with his character. So when he switched allegiances, at first I was like, I don't think he's really doing this. But then I was like, but also, does he even really know what he's doing? I can't tell. So it wasn't so much ominous so much as it was just like, all right, so this is where we're going next. All right, we'll see how this plays out.
It's
Like,
not like a Captain America moment where he goes, "Hail Hydra," and everybody's like, "Ah!" It's like Deadpool, if he says "Hail Hydra," it's like, okay, well, he's just playing a game. It's fine.
Right. So yeah, it didn't strike me as odd necessarily. One thing that I was reminded of by that sequence though is that he is typically classified as an anti-hero, not a hero. And
Mhm.
I do like that about him. I do think that having him be crazy but sort of morally ambiguous at times is a little bit more interesting than having him be crazy but be just like a straight up hero,
Yeah.
like everybody else. So I do like that about him, and I do like that you don't know exactly. It's like, is he actually going to join them just because he thinks it's funny, or because like I could see him doing that not because he's evil, but just because he would be like, this is an entertaining thing to do. Maybe I'll join the Skrulls. Like.
Yeah.
So yeah,
See what
I didn't know
happens.
where it was going to go, but I wasn't necessarily like put off by it or anything. So
You weren't scared that he was gonna go off with the Skrulls and never return?
no, no, that didn't seem likely. If anything, once he boarded their ship, I was like, that ship's not going to take off again.
No.
I don't think they're going to be okay. So I actually had written down a couple of questions that you have already answered, I think, but
Yeah.
one of them was just about the dual narration for Deadpool and whether or not this was the first story to feature that. But did you say that that's Daniel Way's invention?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something that he came up with. And same thing with like there's a couple panels where like Deadpool is like hallucinating or daydreaming or whatever, and like he sees the Skrulls that are attacking him as like little kids who are clamoring for his autograph, and then
Oh
he's
my
talking
gosh.
to Nick Fury later, and he's like this kid who's like, "Oh, Deadpool, you're our only hope. You can save us, and it's only you." And that's another thing that Daniel Way did, and he actually calls it out in the issues as pool-o-vision, like Deadpool's what he's seeing. And this is another thing that sparked controversy because it sort of reclassifies Deadpool from, that sociopath. He's just like, crazy. He's a mercenary with some kind of version of a conscience. Like he'll shoot people, in the head point blank, no worries, but he's also
Right.
not going to, he has some code of honor basically
Sure.
of his
Sure.
own, which maybe no one else understands, but he does have it. Whereas this makes him crazy in like more of a, kind of schizophrenic way, where he's got a warped view of the world, and he's just like, he sees things as different than they actually are, and he's not
Right.
really in reality. And that was very different than what had come before it. So that was
Okay.
something that, just kind of rubbed fans the wrong way. And then
Oh,
to
interesting.
to further go, that way, the Deadpool video game that came out in 2013 was developed by High Moon Studios, published by Activision. Daniel
Okay.
Way wrote the script for that. So
Okay.
in that game, we again have the multiple voices in his head talking to each other and doing all this stuff through the whole game.
Sure.
And that was something that, like, I actually thought that was one of the original, characteristics of Deadpool, because I think before I had read many comics, I actually played the game
Oh,
and
sure. Yeah.
thought that was, just like a normal Deadpool thing until I found
Right.
out, that it wasn't. So, so that's one of the reasons, like, I was also really glad to have Nolan North reprise his role in the Midnight Suns game, because to me, like, when, Ryan Reynolds, yeah, he's Ryan
Hmm.
Reynolds and he's a cool version of Deadpool, but like
Sure.
Nolan North's voice to me is just, I don't know, just kooky and crazy enough to be
Yeah.
Deadpool. And so, having him reprise that role again, I thought was really neat. But yeah, some people not so happy about, those versions and that game, and that kind of
That's interesting. I going back to something you said earlier about the pool of vision.
yeah.
I that was something that I had kind of forgotten about a little bit when in yeah, I read this just a couple days ago. But
Hmm.
I think that's a good segue into talking about how art can sell visual gags, because this artist in particular, Paco Medina, I think really can do humor well, but he can also do the action stuff well. Because when we go into Pool of Vision, it looks hilarious. Like the
Yeah.
Skrull kids have like giant eyes, and they're all like, "Oh, Mr.
Ooh.
Deadpool, can we get an autograph?" And he's like, "Sure, kids, why not?" And really, there's a bunch of guys with guns standing around him. That's what's actually happening. And the same thing with like the little kid Nick Fury that was like, "Oh, save me, you're my only hope." It was like, it was just so funny. And I think another place where the art stood out to me was, and I don't know why this struck me as so off the wall hilarious, but the part where he has his clones, and so first of all, they all keep telling the same stupid joke where they're like, "You have a point on your ears," and they just keep saying that about all the Skrulls, and then they shoot each other in the head. And there's this one panel where they're all blowing each other's heads off for just no reason, and it I don't know why, but the visual depiction of that with the lame jokes right beforehand, I was just dying laughing through that whole section.
And the
So
part where
I
they're
don't
telling the
know.
like knock jokes, so they're like, knock knock, who's there? Boom, and then they shoot
Yeah,
him in
and
the
then they
head.
shoot each other's head off. It's like it makes no sense, but it's so funny. So I don't know. I felt like the art really sold the comedy for me,
Yeah.
and it was a good. This was definitely a good penciler paired with this writer. Whether or not you prefer what this writer does with the character, I don't know. But as
Mhm.
far as what he was trying to achieve, this penciler really pulled it off, I think.
Yeah, they sold it really well. And I think one of the things that works for me is like, with any character, if they are the same, they get stale
Mm-hmm.
after a while. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, Deadpool being crazy and weird and goofy and whatever, if he doesn't change as a character, then, what do we really have to do with him long term that will keep him interesting? So I think,
Mm-hmm.
when we've talked about characters like Ms. Marvel or Captain Marvel, Carol
Sure.
Danvers, and how they've just been changed and retconned and new versions, and that's the writers trying
Mm-hmm.
to find a way to keep the character fresh. But I think with Deadpool, it's really, you just like whatever your version of Deadpool in your heart is, you just write that on the page, and that'll be a cool run. And then when your
Yeah.
time is up, another writer takes over and he'll write Deadpool a little bit differently. So I look at this as an era of like, this was a version of Deadpool that was fun and was kind of the first version that, some people had gotten
Mm-hmm.
into that they thought was cool, and they're kind of slightly different versions out there, but at the core he's
Sure.
still Deadpool. He's
Right.
crazy. He's got his healing factor. He's deadly and dangerous, but he's almost like Ace Ventura. Like Ace Ventura is so smart. Like he's so observant. He can
Yes.
connect the dots to stuff that like people are just like, how did you figure this out? How did you know this? But on the outside, he looks like a freaking idiot. Like he talks like an idiot. He dresses like an
Yes.
idiot. He just seems like a complete doofus. And that's why people, are so unassuming of him, is because they're like, well, this guy's an idiot. He's not going to figure out what my plot is. So,
It's
so
That's a
Deadpool.
that's probably a perfect way to describe it. I never would have made the Ace Ventura connection. I don't mean to interrupt you, but all I
No.
thought of was the scene in the first movie where he's talking about how the woman's death was not a suicide, and he's like opening and closing the glass door over and over. He's like, "Look, sound doesn't transfer through here. No one could have heard it."
This is double pane soundproof glass. There's no way that neighbor could have heard Pedactor scream on the way down with that door shut.
And he's doing it in like the dumbest way possible, but the point that
But it
he's making
illustrates
is
the point.
completely valid, and no
Mhm.
one else would have figured it out. So
Yeah.
it's just like, yeah, that's a really good way to describe Deadpool.
So
Like
that,
he's
yeah,
really smart, but he's also really an
he's
idiot.
very lethal and very dangerous, but
Yeah,
at the same time, he acts a fool.
yeah, he does. So I guess we talked about comedy a little bit. I think because we've talked about it before, not necessarily on the podcast, but one thing that I am really turned off by, because I hate fun, is whenever a movie will try and have like a legitimately emotional beat and then undercut it with a joke at the end. I feel
Mhm.
like that kind of like lets the steam out of it or destroys whatever like the narrative tension was. This book did not feel that way to me. It felt like there was just enough comedy, but that the stakes were actually still real, because it was like, well, the Skrulls really are invading, and them making an entire army of Deadpools is legitimately a really bad thing that could kill a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so it felt like what was going on actually did matter, but he was also joking his whole way through it, and I didn't feel like either one of them overwhelmed the other. Would you?
Yeah, that was another influence on the creation of Deadpool. Like Liefeld was a big Spider-Man fan, which, you know, a lot of people are because his book's been so popular. And so that's sort of where he got this sort of like wisecracking, jokey nature.
Okay.
And I think that, you know, sort of platform works where it's like the character is doing something serious in a serious situation, but they're making light of the situation to keep it from being tense. You know, it's not like a horror movie where somebody's opening the door slowly and they're scared and you're watching and you're scared and you don't know what's behind the door. It's like Deadpool's like, all right, here comes the door, whee, and he's just gonna fling it wide open and he doesn't care. Like him making light of the situation doesn't make the situation less dire or less serious. It just gives you like kind of more of an upbeat, kind of almost like a positive like spin on it, to where, you know, he's not afraid of what's going to happen. He's just kind of along and enjoying the ride.
Yeah. I kind of feel a little bit similarly about this tonally as I do Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which just came out, because it is probably the most serious of the 3 Guardians of the Galaxy movies, but it is still genuinely laugh out loud funny at a lot of parts. It's just that it's much more balanced. I think the second Guardians of the Galaxy maybe got a little bit too jokey for me. It wasn't like so bad that I was like, oh, this is crap. That would be Thor Ragnarok for me, where I'm just like, this is about the death of Thor's homeland. Why are we making jokes all the way through it? Like, that felt like a little bit too far for me. So I don't know. And I didn't see Love and Thunder because I was already kind of turned off by Ragnarok. But yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy 3 felt like it balanced it a lot better, where it was like, we have actual dramatic moments, we have really funny moments, and we can enjoy both of them. And I think that Daniel Way did a good job of like balancing all that in this story too. So
yeah,
I don't know.
There are a lot of fun wisecracks in here, like at the Super Skrull. Deadpool's like, first thing he says is "chill out, hot stuff," because the Super Skrull's got like one arm that's on fire and one arm that's like made of ice, and so he's got like both of the powers. And then he calls him Frosty the Fireman. He calls him a snow cone vendor. He says, "You could have been an air conditioner repairman." And then finally the Super Skrull's like, "Oh, you think you're funny, don't you? Well, I'm going to squeeze your pathetic little body, then smash it into little pieces, which I'll use to keep my drinks cold."
Which is pretty dark, if you think about it.
Very dark, but did not match Deadpool's wit there.
No, he didn't. Yeah, this is not the Super Skrull, I should say, because he's not the one with the FF's powers, but they have sort of like, which I'd never seen before, almost like an army of Super Skrulls that all have mixes of different powers. So that was kind of a new thing to me, but I thought made sense. Like, why wouldn't they genetically engineer a whole bunch of them that can take on different, you know, abilities at once?
Well, they had an entire squadron of them, because that was part of Deadpool's training, was that he was like, all right, so I'm going to train you guys. So the Deadpool Skrull clones are going to fight the, you know, squadron of Super Skrulls, and let's see what happens. And the Deadpool clones like decimate the Super Skrulls. And so then the guys that are in charge are like, you just killed an entire squadron. Like, what the heck? Why would you do that?
And he's like, well, I'm just proving to you how valuable these clones can be, or something.
Yeah.
I'm like,
also decimating their army. So it was like,
is that what you're doing?
Yeah. They knew it wasn't.
That's very funny.
So speaking of the Deadpool clones, so basically what happens is, you know, they clone him, they've got the healing factor, they've got the craziness. Deadpool is like, you know, kind of showing them the ropes. And then basically they have a meltdown because Deadpool gets all serious all of a sudden. And he's like, yeah, you replicated my healing factor. But what you didn't know, Mr. Egghead, who thinks he's so smart, is that, you know, it's the cancer that keeps the healing factor in check. And so the healing factor was actually engineered and designated to fight that cancer, to keep it from consuming me. And so it's a very specific healing factor, and now you've just replicated the whole thing. And so what's going to happen is, without that cancer to keep it in check, they're actually going to replicate themselves into oblivion. And then you see the Skrulls, Deadpool Skrulls, like they start getting balls on them, and they're like getting all nasty, and
they're starting to like swell up into like tumors and stuff because like their
Yeah.
cells are just like replicating out of control. It was gross, but they keep everything, to their credit, everything R-rated happens like off panel in this for the most part. Like I think it said splorch when one of them exploded.
Yeah, and he says it out loud too.
And he says it out loud too. That was the sound effect, but you may just see like a tiny bit of blood from like off panel coming in, so you don't actually see them explode. It's not like gory or anything like that. Which actually was it's not something I put in my notes, but it was something that I noticed. This isn't as R-rated as the Deadpool movie, or either one actually. And I felt like it was a little bit more riding that PG-13 line. I mean, they, of course, because it was a mainstream comic book, they had more serious swear words bleeped out, you know, with the hashtag and at symbols and all that. But I feel like this didn't really reach the, I guess, the violence and the sort of adult content that I had maybe thought it might from seeing the movies. So
yeah,
I don't know.
I think it's just another one of those, you know, whatever flavor the writer tends to go with, and you know, more gory, less gory. I think the idea is that, you know, the gore needs to be part of the humor. So like the splorch thing, like that was kind of gross, but then, you know, Deadpool saying it out loud makes it funny. And then I think he says something later like they got splorched, or, you know, something like that. So
like he's aware of the
humor.
sound effects in his own world.
Yeah.
I did think the cancer leading to the actually being the element that technically keeps Wade alive, because I think it's the healing factor that kills the clones, right? It's that they don't have the cancer.
They don't have the cancer, right?
And so the healing factor actually kills them. I thought that was really interesting from like a sci-fi angle, to be like, oh, his cancer is actually stopping him from dying, not his healing factor. Like that was an interesting angle to take on it that I wouldn't have thought of. So I did appreciate that. I don't know that I needed them to necessarily spend more time on it, but I definitely found it very interesting. So we've really talked about most of the story elements, I guess, except the ending. So essentially what happens is the clones explode, and then Nick Fury calls and he's like, hey, did you get the information I was asking for on the Skrulls? And Deadpool's like, yeah, totally. I just sent it to you right now. And Fury's like, well, did you remember the right passkey? And he's like, yes, totally. I remember the passkey. And then he says some like weird nonsense that is definitely not the passkey. And then it cuts to a panel of showing Norman Osborn, who's like holding the data in his hand or something. And it's like, oh, okay. So Deadpool sent it to Norman Osborn. Also, I think Fury was kind of getting on Wade's nerves at that point too. So I was a little unclear on whether or not that was intentional or not. I don't know what your take was on that.
Yeah, I think it was more that, like, you know, they have the sort of loose alliance where it's like, you know, Deadpool is definitely not an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and he's not, you know, even necessarily like, you know, like the Avengers who'd be like, okay, Fury, we're working with you, whatever you need, we got it. Deadpool is kind of more, you know, he's a mercenary for hire, so he's doing this for the money. And so if something happens that he doesn't like, he may decide that either the money's not worth it or he's not getting paid enough. So yeah, Fury gets on his nerves a little bit, and he's like, passkey, what passkey? I don't remember, you know, trying to like bait him to be like, all right, you know, play ball with me here. So, but I think that he types it in correctly. It's just intercepted by Osborn. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that happens after this. It's been a while since I've read it, but yeah, setting up a lot of stuff like you mentioned earlier with Osborn kind of, I guess, coming on the side of having his own, you know, like the Dark Avengers and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So they've got the Dark Avengers, which are basically the Thunderbolts that are taking the place of the Public Avengers, because I guess because of the Civil War and, you know, various other events that had happened, plus the Skrull invasion, the idea is that like the people have lost their faith in the institution of the Avengers. So why they turned to Norman Osborn of all people, I don't know. But he is like, I don't know if he's the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. or what, but there's a panel at the end of Secret Invasion where he's sitting in a room with, so I guess to further explain the ending of Secret Invasion, Norman Osborn is the one that actually fires a blast and takes off the head of the Skrull Queen, which ends their conflict. So that's sort of like the shot heard round the world where, everybody's like, oh, Norman Osborn saved us. And so then he gets promoted to this high governmental position, basically where he's overseeing his own team. He can recruit his own guys. And I don't remember who exactly is in all of the suits, but they have like an Iron Man variant. And, I think Venom is on the team. And I don't know who else, but yeah, they're like the Dark Avengers. And Osborn is also secretly working with Loki, who at the time was female, and because that came out of the J. Michael Straczynski run, I believe. Loki was like reincarnated as a woman or something. I don't know. And then Doctor Doom is also in on this council with Norman Osborn. So I don't know exactly how the Dark Avengers storyline plays out, but I know that based on that one panel that it's not going to be good. So because anytime you get like Doctor Doom, Loki, and Norman Osborn in a room, it seems like not
yeah, I was going to say those are not the nicest characters to have together.
No. But I did appreciate that the ending of this dovetails right into that story where it's like, okay, well, maybe he got a little bit more covert information or something. Maybe that's how he knew where to be to kill the Skrull Queen or something like that. We don't know what that intel is that Deadpool gave Norman Osborn, but it feels like it lines up with the event really well without turning the Deadpool title into just an event title.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, then you could go read what's going on in the event, or you could just keep reading Deadpool and it would be fine either way. So
right. And that's usually the thing with Deadpool is he has his own kind of version of events, whether it's, hallucinated, imagined in his head, or just, in the writer's head where they're just like, I'm going to throw him into a situation that's not really going to, necessarily tie into the event, but still he has to deal with what's going on with it. But this one actually did tie into it. So that was kind of neat.
Yeah, it was. I think this is kind of best case scenario for an event tie-in where, well, I guess best case scenario is Miss Marvel, where it actually surpasses the event itself. This is probably more fun. This is definitely more fun than the event itself is. Secret Invasion was kind of underwhelming, but it feels like you both can include it and it will feel important, or you can read it by itself and it'll feel important. And either way, you're fine. So I like that. I'm not a fan of being required to buy tie-ins to follow an event. So I think that's a good thing. Famously, DC in, I think it was 2018, did this story arc called Dark Knight's Metal that had like 50 tie-ins that you had to buy to go along with the 6-issue mini. And they were like crucial, like you need them to understand the story. So you're basically stuck buying, 56 comic books that year if you want to get the whole picture. So yeah, this is a lot better where it felt like it, it's kind of standalone and
well, and that's the thing, like
it adds a little bit. So.
If you're collecting those comics, like if you're into Secret Invasion and what's going on, or if you were into it at the time that it came out and you're, hip and up on things that are going on, then this is another thing that you can add into it that will, further your enjoyment of the story. But if you're just like, I just enjoy Deadpool and I don't really, care about the rest of the characters, then you could have felt like, well, this is invading my character a little bit. But fortunately, it didn't go, like we said, too far that it was, totally like railroading it. And it wasn't like there are some event tie-ins, like you mentioned. There was one for like Spider-Women that was, you got, one issue had part of the story of the one book, and then somebody else's book had part 2 and somebody else's book had part 3, and so you had to alternate between the 3 books to be able to get the full story. Otherwise you only get a third of it. And as cool as that is, if you're already collecting all 3, if you're not collecting all 3, then it's a pain. And if you go back in time, like we're looking at this from 2008 and it's now 2023. So going back and reading this now, we're like, oh yeah, Secret Invasion, it's that old, thing that happened before. Is it going to ruin it, reading it now because the event is not popular, hip, it's not what's going on right now. I mean, it kind of is because of Disney Plus, the show coming out, but not like it was, taking over all the comics. But I think it's it still lives up because it's enough that you're tied into the event, but it's not too much that you barely see Deadpool during it.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was really well balanced in that regard.
Yeah. So I guess these are our final thoughts.
Comic.
I think I can go first. I can't remember what I rated the Miss Marvel event tie-in. I think I gave it a 4. This book was a lot of fun. The one thing that it was missing was any kind of real character arc, but I also don't know if that's a fair expectation from a Deadpool title. So I'm a little bit torn on. Yeah, I know. I'm a little bit torn on whether or not I give it a 3.75 or just give it a 4 because they nailed the execution of what they were trying to do. Like, my enjoyment of Miss Marvel was more, and maybe I shouldn't be comparing in that way, but that's sort of my context for this. Is I'm like, that was an event tie-in, this is an event tie-in. I think I'm going to land on a 4 for this. I think that's a pretty solid score. It was funny, it was entertaining, it wasn't overwhelmed by the event. It felt like it had stakes, but it also didn't background Deadpool in favor of the event. So I think this is a really, oddly enough, a really good place to start with Deadpool. So yeah, 4 out of 5 bananas for me.
Yeah, you get just enough of an origin and enough about the character to kind of get what's going on, but it's not like a full, we take you through the history. Sure. And a lot of this is sort of the version of Deadpool that I sort of first encountered, and even X-Men Wolverine origin, the movie, especially the totally wrong portrayal of Deadpool. I've kind of come to sort of appreciate the different versions because it's one of those characters that when you're the writer, you can kind of make him into what you want him to be. And I think that's the character growth that he has, because if Deadpool changes and he stops being so crazy, or he matures a little bit, or he mellows out a little bit, he's not going to be the character anymore. So you need to keep him, some level of zany and crazy and that sort of thing. So I feel like all the different versions kind of have their own place for their era of, when they took place. So yeah, not much of a character arc for him in this story, and excitement level I think is kind of medium. Like there was some fun and stuff that he had, but it also seemed like sort of a run-of-the-mill kind of adventure. And there he interacted with the Super Skrull, the version of the Super Skrull that they had, the Fire Ice guy, a lot, the Egghead Doctor a lot, and he fought a lot, but he didn't really do a whole lot outside of just battle this one little regiment of Skrulls. And maybe it's not fair to say because it's only 3 issues, which typically when we review a story arc, we review like a 6-issue arc or a 5-issue arc. So this being compressed in mini, I'm probably going to go with more of a 3.5. Just because I'm going to dock a little bit points of, I know there are better Deadpool stories out there that are more fun, and the Pool-O-Vision was not necessarily my favorite element, but it didn't detract from the story, so I won't necessarily dock any points from that. And the crazy talking to himself, that sort of thing, I think is more just if you look at it from a storytelling perspective, it's just kind of like a fun and zany thing, and don't think too much about the implications of the character, then you can kind of enjoy it a little bit more, rather than thinking, this changes the character.
I think the dual narration, it's interesting because I would not have been bothered by it. I do think it sticks in my craw just a little bit. And the reason is because we read Moon Knight not so long ago, and I really like that split personality thing being Mark Spector / Stephen Grant / whoever's thing. I really think that fits that character well. And they don't necessarily play it for comedy there, but they play it for escalating the stakes of the situations that he's in, where he's switching back and forth. Or maybe this personality is better suited to deal with this situation, or whatever. And I think it works really excellently there. So I don't know that Deadpool necessarily needs that, but it also wasn't something that destroyed the story for me. And I'm also going to be honest, the Addams Family story that we reviewed earlier is the other sort of comedic book that we've done this year. And that was such a disappointment that this being genuinely funny and genuinely like paying off jokes and,
Mhm.
having stakes and everything, and also not being a one-to-one adaptation of something superior. I think that made me bump it up a little higher too. So just because I'm like, wow, this is actually a funny comic book as opposed to that other thing that was supposed to be. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's gonna about do it for us. You said 3.5. I'm gonna give it a 4. I'm really surprised because this is your boy that you didn't give it that full 4. So
Well, it's not that I didn't like
surprising.
it. I was just like doing the research. I was thinking about all the other Deadpool stories out there, and I was like, this is a
Mhm.
good, good way to ease in. And it's nice, like you mentioned, there's not a whole lot of gore, and
Mhm.
this may be like an entry point for Deadpool. But if you really want to get those like 4s and 4.5 stories, there's a lot of other Deadpool reading to do out there to find those. But yeah,
Right. All right.
maybe next
Well,
time.
as always, context is king.
Oh yeah.
So everyone, go to social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else. And be sure to use our hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast and tell us what you think of this comic, whether you own it in individuals, in trade, or in that giant omnibus that Joe held up earlier.
Well, next episode, we are going to discuss Berserker, published in 2021 by Boom Studios, written by Matt Kint and Keanu Reeves, and penciled by Ron Garney.
And I'm really
It'll be
excited
interesting.
for that one. So
Yeah.
everybody come back, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. We'll get you later.
Comic, Boneless Comics Podcast. Comic.
Because